Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Elevation podcast. I'm excited. I think I'm always excited when I get to talk to a cool guest. But today, Tom Cuddy is back with us. He's an exercise physiologist, and we spoke, 6 months ago or so, and we talked a lot about training as endurance athletes, but we didn't have time to get to one of Tom's other areas of expertise, which is acclimatization at altitude. So that's what we're focused on today. Welcome back, Tom. It's great to have you. Great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. So why don't we just dig into what is going on physiologically when we go from sea level to 10,000 feet? Because there are a lot of adaptations that happen in our bodies in order to allow us to survive at that increased elevation, and then even more so to be able to perform and thrive at that elevation. So maybe we can just start with this overview of what is going on in our bodies when we do that.
So, obviously, when we're going up to altitude, it's not that there's less oxygen. As we go up, it's an issue of pressure. So, considering that there's a lower pressure of oxygen that we're breathing in, this is going to affect pretty much like every system in the body. So, our body's going to have to figure out some ways to adapt and change so that we can get the oxygen we need to, complete all the basic processes of, just living, performing, exercising, all those things. So we can kind of break some of these changes or adaptations into kind of like the acute effects. So like when you first show up, and then also there's some chronic effects that happen over time. One of the first things that your body is going to do when you get up to high altitude is you're going to see a big change in how you're breathing.
Let me pause right there. When we say high altitude, in general, what elevation is that for most people?
Yeah, so we have like kind of moderate altitudes. So that might be in the 5,000 feet to 8,000 feet. Above that, we're looking at we just find say high altitude. So that might be 8,000 feet to maybe 12 or 13, 14,000 feet. And then like very high and extreme altitudes. That's, above those elevations where someone might be summiting peaks. So some of your clients you might be working with, all of those different kind of subsets of high altitude are obviously going to change the severity of what's happening and how our body is going to be responding.
And so the first thing we'll notice, as you said, is an increase in our respiration rate.
Yeah, so both respiration rate and volume. So what we're trying to do is increase the pressure within our lungs to essentially create a driving force. So kind of a pressure gradient so we can get more oxygen into the system.
And that's why you hear this, maybe you're familiar with this technique that mountaineers will employ called pressure breathing.
Tell me more.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can get the physiology right, but what it means practically is that, or what I've been told is to inhale, take a big inhalation, fill everything up. And then as you exhale, to purse your lips like you're blowing through a straw. And I assume that when you breathe that way, you're creating some kind of a pressure differential in your lungs that then makes it easier to get more oxygen into your lungs.
I think there's a pressure component there, but I also think a lot about how much CO2 someone's exhaling.
Okay. Yep.
So if you're kind of pursing your lips and controlling, the rate of your exhalation, that's going to be controlling how much CO2 you're expiring.
Yeah.
And CO2 is just as important to this discussion as oxygen, which I think we'll dive into today. But if you think about it, like if you were going to be hyperventilating, so just like panting and breathing really hard, you might feel a little bit lightheaded, maybe a little bit faint. And that's not necessarily from not having enough oxygen. It's usually from exhaling too much CO2. And CO2 is super interesting. It has a lot of different functions in the body, but one that I think is really important for altitude is its effect on the brain. So CO2 is, we think about it as this like metabolic garbage. When we're exercising, we have a lot of CO2 buildup, but we actually closely regulate CO2 levels in the body. And with the brain, CO2 actually acts as a vasodilator. So if you're exhaling too much CO2 and the content of CO2 in your bloodstream gets too low, we'll actually start to see some vasoconstriction, so some
Okay.
tightening of your blood vessels. Yeah, just one kind of, point of discussion there with breathing, where you obviously want to be breathing in more and more air to get more oxygen and more driving pressure into the lungs. But if you're doing that and offloading too much CO2, I mentioned one thing, but there's a whole host of other things that could happen from dropping your CO2 levels too low.
And I imagine that vasoconstriction in your brain is why you would get a headache
Yes.
at
Um,
elevation.
Yeah, so acute mountain sickness, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this. And if you think about, blood flow going into your brain and then coming out of it, and when we're in the brain, we have higher pressure occurring. That's going to create maybe some swelling at the brain, and then also pair that with some dehydration, which we'll chat
Mhm.
about. And that's just kind of, really going to augment like a headache symptom.
Well, this explains why. So I get migraines occasionally. And when I'd have AMS, when I'd have a headache in the mountains, I would take my migraine medication and that would resolve the headache. And I never knew why, but it's because that medication is a vasodilator.
Oh, yeah.
And that,
Interesting.
interesting. Yeah, I always wondered why that worked because I could take Tylenol or another pain med, it wouldn't touch the headache. But if I
Yep.
took the migraine medication, it would. And so that's
Hmm.
what it was doing. It was dilating those blood vessels in my brain.
Yep.
So fascinating. Okay. So we talked about respiration rate and pressure. What else is going on when we subject ourselves to elevation?
So we can think about our blood as a next factor. So a bunch of things going on there. In that acute phase, so when you first show up, we're going to start to experience what's called renal diuresis, which is a fancy name for essentially saying we're going to start peeing a lot.
More.
um, so our blood is made of obviously red blood cells, and then another big part of it is our plasma volume. So that's the kind of the fluid content of our blood. So by essentially letting off fluid in our blood, we're going to make our blood thicker. So this gets into our concentration of hemoglobin to
Hmm.
total blood volume, which is called hematocrit. So by decreasing total blood volume, you're essentially going to be having a higher amount of hemoglobin to total blood volume, which in essence will, increase your oxygen carrying capacity. So obviously this could be good up to a certain point where we might become too dehydrated, letting off too much fluid. And this, I think, along with a lot of the altitude adaptations, is kind of in the side of it being compensatory. Like we're focusing on this one important thing of oxygen transport at the cost of other areas of functioning. And I think it's helpful to think about this as there's always like a working hierarchy in physiology of, what is our body going to prioritize the most, and what are things that like we're going to give up, or, we might think about being a little bit more dysfunctional so that we can, have our oxygen transport just be where we need it to be.
So our bodies, in terms of that hierarchy, our bodies want to get enough oxygen to our brains, our heart, I would guess, our lungs, and the rest of the systems in our body are less important.
Yeah. Even if you think about the brain specifically. So obviously there's like all these different parts of the brain. So, our hypothalamus and our brainstem are important for just like daily functioning, just to
Hmm.
survive. And then we have other areas of our brain that might be associated with like memory, decision
Right.
making. And if you look at some of the altitude research on, someone exercising in a hypoxic state, you'll actually see blood flow will be redirected away from areas like your cerebral cortex to areas of like your hypothalamus, because it's saying like, hey, like we might make some poor decisions and we can get away with that, but we can't get away with not
With
being able to
breathing.
actually function.
Right. So that could explain why mountaineers experience memory loss, or people who've spent a lot of time in elevation. Like I was just talking to a
Yeah.
friend shout out to my friend Tracy, just finished climbing all 14 8,000 meter peaks.
Wow.
And I was talking to her yesterday and she's like, I don't know, I can't remember. I've killed too many brain cells.
Yeah, again, like that, there's a acute, process of like we see that distribution of blood flow to certain areas of the brain. But then from a chronic perspective, we might actually start to lose some gray matter in our brain from just that chronic stress over time. So definitely important for someone like that to like not be planning too many trips in a short period of time so you can actually like let the real recovery happen.
Which I want to get to recovery, and specifically this question came from one of my athletes. People now are starting to climb back to back 8,000-meter peaks. And so her
Yeah.
question as she prepares to do this is, what should that recovery time look like? So we'll get to that, but let's finish kind of rounding out the physiology. And so we're going to breathe more, we're going to pee more, we're going to release some hormones as well that are going to cause
Yeah.
us to create more red blood cells.
Yep. So that process, so we have a hormone called erythropoietin. In the cycling world, everyone knows as EPO. So EPO,
Infamously.
yeah, right. So when our oxygen saturation gets below about 85%, we're going to start to see a big response in EPO. There's a couple time points of acclimatization here. We're going to see a big initial increase in EPO in the first like several days, a huge spike. And then about 2 weeks after, there's also a lot of variability there where some people might maintain their EPO levels and other people might see a big drop off. The important thing there is not everyone sees the same effect in the EPO response. So to have a good EPO response that leads to increases in hemoglobin mass, we need to keep our hemoglobin high initially and then also sustain that. And the actual adaptation might take 2 to 4 weeks to actually have new hemoglobin in the system that we can use.
And the degree to an individual's EPO response is based on genetics, or like what determines?
I think there's a genetic component to it. So everyone's going to have a slightly different response to this. So we're going to have something called our HIF1 alpha, which is basically a gene regulator that responds to hypoxia.
Mm-hmm.
So some people might see a huge response in this HIF1 alpha, and that's going to really help with the process of
Okay.
EPO release. But then there's also this component of individuality of like, let's say we were controlling how much oxygen we were both taking in, like we were in an oxygen chamber and we dropped down, and that term is the fraction of inspired oxygen. So normal, like at sea level, that's 21% oxygen. So if we went into an altitude chamber or went up high, we might drop down to 15% or even like 10% in extreme scenarios. So you and I might have a much different response in our arterial oxygen saturation, where, I might drop down all the way to 70%. But since
Mm-hmm.
you spend more time at altitude, which is another factor in the mix there, you might stay at like 85%. So I'm going to do a lot worse than you might.
Okay.
So there's it's kind of like training in a way, like how much exposure you've had previously. And then there's also some genetic side of it too.
So it is true that there's this, I refer to it as muscle memory, even though it's not exactly muscular. But like, I feel like people who have been at elevation somehow do better at elevation in subsequent trips. That I assume is because we become more efficient at the physiological adaptations, or I feel like my body just knows, oh, like, all right, this is where I'm starving for oxygen. These are the things I need to start doing in order to take care of myself. But there is some sort of like, that's been proven that people who've had more experience at elevation tend to do better when they go back.
Yeah, I think pre-exposure is one of the biggest variables, how well you might do.
And you mentioned genetics, and I want to talk about this fascinating study that you sent me as we were prepping for this talk. So hear a lot, and we work with Sherpa in the mountains, and we hear, and I've witnessed them just being like complete rock stars
Yeah.
at elevation. Like I remember on Everest, our Sherpa team would get up at base camp. They would carry 40-pound loads up to Camp 2 and return before I had finished breakfast in the morning. And you just look at these men and you think, how are they doing that? And so, of course, those populations have been studied, and there are some studies looking at Tibetan people as well as Andean people and how their bodies have adapted over time to this
Mm-hmm.
reduced exposure to oxygen. So,
Yeah, I think that's just it's such an interesting case study because the Tibetan populations, there's evidence that they've been there for, around 25,000 years, whereas populations in the Andes might have only been there for maybe like 10, 11,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they've just had different genetic, responses because it's just longer durations of time there. And what they have ended up finding is that these two groups, they both obviously thrive at high altitude, right? I spent some time in Peru a few years ago and,
Yep.
just doing some trekking between like 13 and 17,000 feet. And I was dying. I'm from sea level. This was much harder for me, but our guide, he's great. He's doing all the
No big deal.
work. It's no big deal. If we think about these two groups, we know that they both thrive, but they're thriving for different reasons. So if we look at Andean populations, they're known to have a really high, basically, hematocrit. So how much red blood cells they have in their bloodstream. So obviously that's a much higher oxygen carrying capacity, whereas the Tibetan populations, they're known to have some differences in how their ventilation and pulmonary system works. And what's kind of most important is they don't tend to experience the same pulmonary vasoconstriction that sea level natives experience when they first go up to altitude. So they're essentially allowing their blood flow to, go through the body much easier with way less resistance. And this is like one of the main drivers of how they can functionally thrive at altitude. And when you kind of dig into it a little bit deeper, we'll see that the Tibetan populations, they just breathe more at rest. So their just ventilation is much
Mm-hmm.
higher. And this is supported from higher levels of nitric oxide in their pulmonary bloodstream.
It's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, totally. So just to kind of go into that nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is basically a gas that is stored within your endothelium of your blood
Mm-hmm.
vessels. So your endothelium is this single layer of cells that lines all your blood vessels, and it's storing something called nitric oxide that when it's released from the endothelium into the bloodstream, we're going to see this vasodilation happen.
Mm-hmm.
So allowing better oxygen transport, and yeah, it's going to just totally change how they're functioning.
So, just sidebar, is there a reason then that we don't use nitrous oxide to treat acute mountain sickness?
I think that there's like in the mountains, I would assume that like people will just treat with oxygen.
Right.
It might be just like easier, but there are some cases where in the research they're actually using nitric oxide to help treat or like basically just see how someone's responding to it. And it does show that it does help when someone actually is at high altitude.
Seems like that could be a way to advance how we treat acute mountain sickness in the mountains. Maybe it's not as practical to have, I mean, we have oxygen there anyway if we're at high elevation, but it would seem like maybe if we had nitric oxide, that would be a better way to treat the symptoms of AMS.
Yeah, I think it's something to consider. I think with like mountain sickness, so AMS, HAPE, HACE, there's different reasons someone might be going through dysfunction. In the example of like HAPE, so if someone's, really having a lot of pulmonary arterial pressure buildup, that might be something someone could think about is like, all right, we need to actually open up our lungs and
Yeah.
allow better blood flow. So I could see on that side of it being, a great therapeutic. But if someone's just like low on oxygen, I think that's just like the first
They
thing
just need
that
oxygen.
needs to
Right.
happen.
Right. I might start taking nitric oxide with me.
Yeah. Talk about some ways to increase it
Okay. That
naturally.
might be more practical.
Yeah.
But that's what a drug like nifedipine does, right? Which we'll take for pulmonary edema. It changes the pressure, I think, in your lungs and it allows oxygen blood to flow more readily and that reduces the symptoms. I'm probably butchering this, but I think
Yeah, no, I
there's
think
some
that's
relationship
a
there.
good description.
Yeah. Okay. So, based on what we've studied from these populations that have adapted and now thrive at elevation, are there things that we can take from that we as recreational mountaineers can do in order to make our acclimatization easier?
I think when we approach acclimatization, it's important to consider all the variables. So I think a lot of times people are very heavily focused on the red blood cell production. So, people might be, using altitude tents. That can be a great way to do that if you're spending enough time in the altitude tents, obviously.
Hmm.
But I think just highlighting that there's other ways to thrive at altitude and remembering that our first thing that really changes at altitude is that ventilation.
Right.
So just for kind of context, so like if you're at, you went up to about 4,000 meters compared to sea level. So the amount of cardiac output it takes just to support ventilation at sea level might be like 2 to 5%. And then if you go to 4,000 meters, you're going to require maybe a 20 to 25% of your cardiac output just to support ventilation at rest.
Basic functions.
Yep. So you need to have, it's called your hypoxic ventilatory response. This has to happen. You do need to make sure your pulmonary system and ventilation is robust enough. So I think for some people, you definitely want to make sure you're optimizing the red blood cell side of it.
Hmm.
But how are your lungs doing when you go up to high altitude? Do you have the capacity to breathe at the volumes that you'll need to? How efficient is that going to be? And are you going to be someone that is going to really experience a lot of that pulmonary hypertension? You might need to test that a little bit. And if you're someone that's, you're fine on your red blood cell count, but when you go up to altitude and you're experiencing that pulmonary hypertension, that's something that you also need to think about too.
And so you're suggesting you could test this at elevation, or sorry, at sea level or at your home elevation before you go higher in order to determine how you'll function?
Yeah, so you could obviously get like your hemoglobin
Right.
measured and have some experience with that. But thinking about that pulmonary end of it, so you could essentially like see what your response is with a hypoxic test of sorts,
Okay.
going into altitude chamber, things like that. But I think I'm suggesting more of like, what are some things you can do to make sure your lungs are going to be able to tolerate that stress? So we
Hmm.
mentioned there's a big shift in blood flow from other areas of the body to your lungs. So there's a pressure component to that. Like, let's say I'm doing a metabolic test on someone. I can look at, how much volume of air they can breathe in and out of their lungs, their respiratory frequency, their tidal volume, just getting some ideas there of like how someone's lung functioning is
Okay.
prior. And a lot of times I'll even see during an exercise test that someone just hyperventilates anytime that intensity becomes hard. That would be someone that I'm like, hey, like I notice that, you start exercising hard, you're beginning to hyperventilate. So at altitude, that's going to be, accelerated so much more.
Totally. What do we consider hyperventilation? How many respirations per minute?
When I think about hyperventilation, like definitely thinking more about the how much CO2 someone's letting off.
Okay.
Like during exercise, it's totally normal to see ventilation rates go like at easy exercise intensity from like 20 to maybe 35 breaths per minute. As things get harder, someone's going from like 35 to 45. Some people might max out a test, where they're at 60 breaths per minute. In terms of hyperventilation, though, it's for me, I'm thinking about when their breathing frequency is increasing, are we seeing a decrease in tidal volume? So
Okay.
volume per
So
breath.
they're breathing less efficiently.
Yes. So taking short and shallow breaths
Right.
where the air isn't getting into like all aspects of the lungs.
Okay.
So you'll basically see like, ventilation rates going up. So they're getting to like 45 breaths per minute. And
Hmm.
then maybe they're taking like 3-liter breaths through
Hmm.
most of the test. And then all of a sudden that drops down to like, 1 liter, per breath.
Right.
So that would be for me, definitely hyperventilation. So it's kind of depends on the person. And there's other like pulmonary kind of function tests you can do, give some insight into like the robustness of how someone breathes.
Hmm.
And yeah, those things can be helpful too.
And I imagine those are things that we can train, right? If you are a short, shallow breather all the
Yep.
time or at exercise, there are breathing techniques you could employ and practice before your climb that would teach you to start to breathe more deeply and totally fill up your lungs with every breath.
Yeah. So I've been recommending this product. It's called an isocapnic breathing device.
Yeah, I've heard of
So it's like
this.
this breathing bag
Yep.
mechanism, where you can do different workouts where you might be thinking about volume. So you're essentially like breathing into this bag and watching a metronome, and
Mm-hmm.
you might be doing like, 10 breaths per minute, and that's focused on total volume. So just like using all aspects of your lungs. And then let's say you're doing more like power breathing. So you might go up to like 40 breaths per minute.
Okay.
And that's like very quick, but you're making sure that each breath is equal. So you're not
Okay.
like starting to like
One big one,
hyperventilate.
one little one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And so then this is related also to circling back to CO2, because we interviewed someone, Anthony LaRubio, who has this product where like it's a technique of breathing that makes you can handle more CO2. You're not as sensitive to CO2. And also some of the techniques that he recommends will allow you to start to produce EPO. So yeah, what are you thinking?
I haven't seen the EPO side of that necessarily. Yeah, just haven't come across
Yeah.
that. But the CO2 tolerance, I think,
Yes.
is definitely something you can work on training. And, people have low CO2 tolerance even at sea level. And the implications of that are you're offloading too much CO2 too often, which, yeah, has all these different effects. Yeah, I think training that CO2 tolerance prior to altitude could be something that's very effective. When we go to altitude, CO2 is rising partly because we're just going to be burning more carbohydrates, basically control like activation of our sympathetic nervous system, which is going to be then burnt, like causing us to burn more glycogens and more carbohydrates. And that in itself is just going to be increasing CO2. Then throw on the exercise component to it at altitude, where you're really going to be increasing how much CO2 you're losing. And if you can learn to then control that CO2 by holding on to it a little bit longer and not breathing quite as fast, that could have some serious implications for things like oxygen transport too. So when our CO2 levels get too low, we're actually going to see that oxygen will not be able to release itself from red blood cells as
Mhm.
easily. So this is called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, where basically the red blood cells have an affinity, how tightly bound they are to oxygen. So when CO2 does get too low,
Mhm.
bond there is solid. So with higher CO2, you can
Ah,
actually offload oxygen from red blood cells into working muscle, which is just another component of that kind of CO2 tolerance.
okay. So all this is convincing me I need to become more CO2 tolerant, not just to be in the mountains, but I think also just to be able to like go on a trail run.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, that's very cool. So if someone came to you and they're like, I want to know, like, I'm getting ready to hike to Everest Base Camp. I live in Miami. What are the things? So we talked about some of them. Are there any other things you would look at in terms of their like physiology or their current fitness level in order to suggest that they would be okay at elevation? Because what I've heard from people is some people are just predisposed, like you're either good at it or not good at it. But I've never heard like, here's the test to say you're going to perform well at elevation or you're going to adapt well at elevation. But it sounds like there are some things that you see, one of them around respiration and ventilation, that you see in your lab that are indicators of how someone will do at elevation.
I'm basically just suggesting so it's kind of similar to like how someone might approach like an endurance event where we might say like, you have a high VO2 max,
Right.
good lactate threshold, running economy. So they're kind of like thinking about all these variables in kind of isolation. What I'm suggesting is that I think there's some similarities to altitude and making sure you're kind of checking some boxes there. We just talked about that breathing component. So you need to have a good ventilatory capacity and the ability to handle, the high volume of breathing, blood flow.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned red blood cell count. So that's something you can easily figure out with your doctor. You might want to think about, if you can spend some time at altitude prior,
Yep.
understanding like what is your response response to red blood cell growth. Since there is a lot of variability there, you want to kind of figure out, all right, if I'm not seeing this growth happen before my trip, do I need to be supplementing with iron or,
Right.
taking other interventions there? And then there's certainly a lot of training components there that I wouldn't say there's always a test for it, but making sure someone's approaching the training component, because if you're not fit and then you're going to go climb Everest or whatever it might be, like that's a huge component to it as well.
Totally. Yep. And you mentioned a couple times hypoxic tents. I know there's different opinions about whether they're beneficial or not for mountaineers or mountain athletes. And I've used them for many years. And I think that my experience has been that they're helpful. They help me, say, get to base camp if that's at like 17 or 18,000 feet and I live at sea level. And they help me get to base camp in a much less stressed state, and it's just I'm healthier when I get there. I'm not as convinced that although people have done it, I'm just not as convinced that you can sleep in a tent and go climb Everest in 2 weeks, but there are people who've done it. Like, what are your experience of working out or sleeping in those hypoxic environments? Do you see benefit from that?
I think there's definitely benefit. I think the actual application of the tents is important, because with the tents, a lot of times people are just trying to expand their red blood cell count.
Right.
So, how much time does someone need to spend in a tent, and for how many weeks for that to actually be effective? So, you're looking at probably 8 to 12 hours a day for probably 3 weeks straight. If you can pull that off, that's great. There's probably a cost benefit ratio there.
There's a lifestyle ratio.
Yeah, totally. Like, does that impact your sleep, mental health,
Love life,
all things like that? Yeah, love life, that's huge. I think like they have their purpose, but I think a lot of people, like, they might use them for a bit, they might, I don't know, be in there a couple hours a day. And is that actually worth your time versus being like fully committed, like, 3 weeks, 8 to 12 hours a day? That has to happen to actually see the benefit. So I think in my head, I'm like, I just question, like, are people actually following through with that protocol? And what's the cost benefit ratio there?
Totally. I agree with the cost benefit. What I see in my coaching practice is that people who have invested in the tent are pretty committed to following through with it. What tends to get in the way is travel. So people are also busy with work travel, and then that interrupts it. And then we have to like reset, not fully, but it doesn't advance the benefits that you were seeing from sleeping in it. And then the cost benefit equation for me has to do with how well you're recovering, because if you're training hard, you're getting ready to go to Everest, you're probably putting in 20 hours a week to train, and you need to recover to offset all of that stress to your body. And the best way that we have to do that is to sleep. Yeah. And so if you're sleeping poorly, you're not recovered, and therefore you're not going to get the most out of your next training session.
Yeah. So like on my end, I'm curious from your experience of like, coaching people for this. So like, what is a normal training load for a week for, I'm sure it depends on like what phase they're in, but
Yep.
I would love to talk about that, because, that's going to have so many implications of like, is it helpful to add in this extra stress on top of the training load you're already doing?
Right. And so if someone were sleeping hypoxically or training hypoxically, they're in the last phase of their training, which is where they're devoting the most hours per week to training. And so that probably looks like one recovery day, where if I can convince them to do nothing, I feel like I'm winning, but most people want to do something. So an easy day of recovery, you're probably doing strength training for an hour or 75 minutes, 3 days a week. And then you're doing some sort of cardio, zone 2 cardio, 3 days a week for, we'll say, an hour or 75 minutes. And then typically on the weekend, then you're doing some longer endeavors where you're carrying weight, and those could be between 3 and 6 hours. A significant training load. Yeah. And then if someone wants to add hypoxic training on top of that, I support it fully, but we have to really be careful, to your point, about not just overloading you with so much work that you can't get it done and you're going to be stressed. Yeah. So I will tend to do things like do your zone 2 ride, do half of it hypoxically, do the rest of it with the mask off. Or for people who can't hike, if you're on a treadmill, to do your weighted carry, do some of that time hypoxically. and then sleep in it. It requires, for me as a coach, daily looking at their stats, looking at how they're recovering and checking in with them to see how they feel.
Are they measuring oxygen saturation during those sessions?
Yeah. So if they're doing an exercise session, and those are pretty short, like 30 minutes is
Yep.
great. They're measuring saturation. I have them do it like every few minutes, and I don't want it to be below 80.
Okay.
And then when they sleep, they measure it when they wake up, but they're not measuring it. Well, their watch may be continually measuring it overnight, but I find that in the hypoxic tents, the watch measurement of oxygen saturation is not very accurate. So they're usually just getting one measurement when they wake up in the morning. And I don't want that to be below 85.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, when people will sometimes say to me, I woke up in the middle of the night, like gasping for air, and then I know we've gone too far and we have to
Yeah.
take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the primary measure, saturation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would think that there's probably a component of like someone's starting point of like how fit they are and like how fast you're ramping up their training load in conjunction with this hypoxic stress. So some people might be able to handle that better than others, it sounds like.
Yeah, I find that too. And I don't know what that factor is, what determines that, but I find that some people just seem to be more fatigue tolerant than others. They
Mm,
will, the application that we use for training measures a person's fatigue. And some people, if it gets to a level of say 40, they're like, I need a break. I'm
right.
cranky. I'm not sleeping well. And for other people, it will be 100. And I'm like, are you doing, like, how are you
Yeah.
sleeping? Are you feeling okay? How's your mood? And
Hmm.
they'll say that they're okay. So, and I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's just like experience as an athlete, people who've been, are more attuned to being active over the course of several years versus people who have less experience, if it's genetics. But there definitely seems to be a different tolerance level for people.
One of the interesting things to kind of go back to that study on the Tibetans and Indians was it appears that people with the Tibetan roots can actually function at lower oxygen saturations, even like sea level natives, and be like totally fine. Plays into that point you're describing of like a different level of tolerance
Yep.
of that population.
I think that's what I found too. And I remember being at, I think it was camp 3 on K2, measuring my saturation. It was 37.
Wow.
And my hand was cold. It was a cheap
Yeah. Hmm.
pulse ox, but still, it was incredibly low. And I didn't feel like, maybe I just was hypoxic and out of my mind and didn't know, but I really felt like I was doing okay.
Your prefrontal cortex wasn't on.
It was definitely not online. Yeah. Let's maybe get to some questions. I had a
Great.
couple questions from people. Unless there's anything you want to say, Tom, about like anything else we should be thinking of before we get ready to go to elevation.
I think we could probably comment a little bit on that nitric oxide piece of
Okay.
ways to like naturally get it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So that might be, yeah, lead us into some discussion there. So one form of nitric oxide, so you can get it in basically like dietary sources. Things like beetroot, leafy greens, there's different like cured meats and stuff like that. Generally, like beetroot is like one of the best sources of increasing the availability of nitric oxide. So that might be kind of an interesting dietary source.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure you can get beetroot capsules, right? Like
Yep,
it's just,
capsules and then
yeah.
little like supplement, like kind of 5 hour energy, like
Okay.
shots they make too. And then there's another intervention that I studied in grad school called ischemic preconditioning.
Hmm.
Have you come across this in
I have
the
had,
mountaineering
I've worked
space?
with people who've done ischemic PT,
Okay, so blood flow restriction.
right? But not what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was kind of curious of like how much this has been adopted. It's been researched decently well in the last decade or so with altitude, but essentially it's a intervention where someone's going to be just passively just sitting there. It's kind of funny. You're applying a tourniquet to like
I read
your
that.
leg or your arm, and you're essentially occluding blood flow. And this is an example of like what we call like a hormetic. So it's like a small dose of something that would be otherwise lethal, but then leads to some benefit. So we basically studied the use of this intervention. So we'll just call it IPC.
Mm-hmm.
So you're basically sitting, putting on a blood pressure cuff on your leg or arm for repeated cycles of 5 minutes. So you might go, 5 minutes on your left leg, and then switch to the right, 5 minutes, and you keep doing this for about 30 to 40 minutes. So this is another way you can actually increase the amount of nitric oxide that's circulating in your bloodstream. And that's going to happen like immediately post intervention. So
Okay.
you do the intervention, it lasts for about 24 hours. And
Huh.
then after that first kind of window of protection of improved blood flow, you'll actually see for the next 3 to 4 days an upregulation in the production of nitric oxide. So this is something that has been studied in like altitude, like chambers, and also like, doing performance tasks like, trail running at altitude.
Mm-hmm.
And it does show that people will see improved pulmonary arterial pressure and just like improved blood flow.
So there's a
And there's
systemic effect. It's not just in the muscle that was occluded.
correct. Yep. So basically, like
Hmm.
you're occluding, the blood flow in your leg, and then when you release that blood flow back in, the sheer stress of the blood traveling through those blood vessels again is going to cause basically what's called reactive hyperemia. So that's going to be just a huge increase in blood flow that is going to flush out all the nitric oxide and then different metabolites that are going to be spread throughout the whole body. So it is a systemic response.
Fascinating. Now I'm going to be sitting at Everest Base Camp with a blood pressure cuff.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for you just to like experiment with it. What I'll do is I'll set up clients with a leg blood pressure cuff and then give them the protocol. And I generally find that repeated days or like multiple days within a week leads to the best benefit. So I've had like clients, go do a high altitude, summit, or like they might be doing racing, like a
Right.
ultra marathon or whatever in like
Right.
high elevation. And I'll have them for, days leading into their event doing this daily to hopefully get some better blood flow and nitric oxide in their system.
And so then your body, you're carrying with you more nitric oxide.
Yeah, so the intervention is causing you to release nitric oxide
Okay.
into the bloodstream from your endothelium.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also is going to upregulate the production of nitric oxide for several days after.
And that's going to help me. That's going to change the pressure in
So
my
that's going to,
lungs.
yep. So that's going to improve or just cause vasodilation in the pulmonary, circulation, which essentially trying to mimic what is happening with the Tibetan populations, just with their natural physiology.
I'm totally down to try this.
Yeah. The first time you do it, it hurts.
I've heard that
But
from athletes that I coach that they're doing it. They want more blood flow in an area to promote healing. And they all say it really, really hurts when when the blood
yeah,
comes back, right? It's not when it's ischemic that it hurts. It's when the blood comes back that it starts to hurt.
I think it's called blood flow restriction
Yeah.
training. So that's partial occlusion. I've done that. I'm certified, BFR, whatever. A couple years ago, I took a course. When the blood flow rushes back in, it does tend to hurt. With ischemic preconditioning, this is full occlusion. So you're essentially pumping a blood pressure cuff up to 200 millimeters of mercury. And then, like it just hurts that, like just getting used to like the pressure in your leg.
Wow.
I'll have to send you like the exact protocol of how to use this.
Okay. I'm super curious.
But it's actually interesting. Like you can feel the vasodilation happening, like when you take the cuff off, and the response gets bigger and bigger each time. So let's say
You
you
can,
do like 8 cycles of it. By the end of it, you feel like warm and fuzzy, like just all your like blood vessels just like fully opened up. And I think it actually feels good because I'm just kind of used to using it. But
yeah.
I remember the first time I did it my arm. This was in grad school. And I was like, oh my God, this hurts so bad. But it's one of those things I think you just kind of get used to it and you
Right.
kind of know what to expect.
And it probably also increases your core temperature, or at least
It feels like that. I bet it does.
I bet it does too.
I don't really know what the literature says on that, but it feels that way. It's actually funny. I'm sure you have people you've worked with who, their feet get really cold. I actually had a friend I did this with who, she was, essentially like when she was out skiing, her feet were just like killing
Right.
her because they were getting so cold. So like after skiing, I like showed her, with the blood pressure cuff how to do it, and her feet just like warmed up. I don't know that there's a lot of research into that specifically, but it would be fun to mess around with it.
It would totally be fun. I'm going to do that. Okay, I'm buying a blood pressure cup. I will let you know. Okay, well, then let's get to some questions. So, this is sort of maybe related to what we were talking about. And this is about the endothelial growth factors and how that growth occurs with intermittent altitude exposure. So, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, because the question is what does that exposure look like? How much elevation do I need to gain over, say, where I live? And how frequently and for how long to actually be acclimatized? And you were saying there's a lot of factors, right? It's not that easy to just write a simple protocol that's going to work for everyone.
So maybe we can go through and define the vascular endothelial growth factor.
That's probably a good idea.
Yeah, so essentially it's a hormone that gets released in response to hypoxia that's going to lead to the increase in how many capillaries you have within your muscles. So this is important because this is going to help with extraction of oxygen from your blood into your working muscles, which is obviously beneficial. It also helps with like recovery. So like getting metabolites out of the muscle bed, continue to exercise. We kind of mentioned this response is going to have a time course of like how long it takes, a certain elevation. But generally with a lot of the altitude adaptations, if you're above, I'd say like 2,500 meters, even like 2,000 meters in some instances, like that can be enough to see a response. Basically, like within the first few days, we'll start to see this initial response of like more of this hormone. So we'll just call it VEGF, VEGF. And then the process of this hormone leading to more capillaries is called angiogenesis. And this is going to take about 2 weeks for this process to like get going. But to really notice the functional adaptations of this process, we're looking at like a 3 to 4 week exposure.
Period. And then those extra red blood cells live 120 days.
Like extra as in like the ones you're
the
getting.
New ones. Yeah. Well, any red blood cell survives 120 days, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds right.
My question is, if you're going through this process to pre-acclimatize, what clients have said to me is, well, great, I've been sleeping at 20,000 feet, and then I'm going to go to Aconcagua, and I'm going to be in Mendoza for 3 days, and that's, I don't remember, 5,000 feet. And I'm not going to be back up to 20,000 feet, which is what I've acclimatized to, for like a week or longer. So it would seem to me that during that time, those new red blood cells would start to die off.
Yeah. So if you think about like, there's a certain energy demand to maintaining and producing more red blood cells. If we look at altitude training research, so people, getting the benefit of altitude and then performing at sea level, when they're back at sea level, those new red blood cells will last about 2 weeks.
Oh, 2 weeks. That is closer to what I've experienced in real life.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes much more sense.
So it's not like you go down, you like completely lose it right away.
But your body's like, these are extra. I don't need these anymore.
Yeah. Like, why do we need this? This is energy intensive.
Okay. 2 weeks makes a lot more sense to me. The next question, are there benefits to alternating between high altitude and sea level when training for a high altitude climb, or is it more beneficial to only train at altitude? I would say, I'll give you my coach's input. There is benefit to alternating because you get to recover better. But I guess from an acclimatization standpoint, it would probably be better to always be at altitude.
Yes, from a acclimatization perspective, as long as you're not going down to sea level too long. My mind always goes to the training side of it, where, if you're at high altitude, the quality of your training sessions might be lower, and the fatigue is going to be higher. So this then gets into like, where is someone's starting point? Do they have a lot of gains in fitness to be made prior to their high altitude training? If they're already quite fit and they don't need to like work on speed or aerobic capacity more than what they already have, I would trend towards, we should really focus on the altitude components of acclimatization.
That makes
'Cause if you
sense to
send
me
someone
too.
that's not fit at all up to Everest, and then you're asking them to climb, I don't know how many
Yeah,
vertical meters it is, that might just be like too much for them,
absolutely would be.
even if they're acclimatized.
Yep. Fitness is the foundation.
I like that.
And then the last question, and I alluded to this earlier, is there's, this trend that people want to climb as many 8,000 meter peaks as they can in a season. Or I get that it makes sense if you've taken time off work and away from your family and you've traveled to Nepal and you have the chance to climb more than one. Why wouldn't you do that? It gets tricky, of course, training and recovering and taking care of yourself when that's your goal. And so this question comes from someone who's getting ready to climb a few 8,000 meter peaks in one trip. And she's wondering if when she comes back to base camp, so she climbs the first one, she has a week maybe to recover before she travels to the next one. Should she be recovering with oxygen, like supplemental oxygen at base camp? Or does it make more sense to just sort of let her body? I think maybe she needs a blood pressure cuff, but but what would you recommend?
So I think the question is like, do we bring oxygen to this camp and are we going to use it? My sense is that so when we're at high elevation, our basal metabolic rate, so just, the energy required to just do basic body functioning, that's going to be increased a lot. You're already like putting a lot of resources into just basic functioning. So then throw in the high altitude climb where, you're trekking for hours and hours, probably not sleeping. If you do require some extra recovery, you're going to definitely offset the demand by having that oxygen there so that you're not just focused on just survival.
Right.
You can then put resources into rebuilding your system and then having the strength for that next
Yep.
attempt.
Totally makes sense. We just increase the number of bottles of oxygen being used on 8,000 meter peaks.
Sorry.
Anything else? Like, I have so many tangential questions I want to ask, but I feel like we covered a lot in an hour. Any other tips or things you'd share with people if they're planning a trip to elevation?
We definitely covered a lot. I mean, if you have more of those tangential questions, I'm always game for a
Okay.
rabbit hole. Yeah, I think just like taking a really balanced approach of like not overly fixating on one component of the
Yeah.
picture and making sure you're thinking about all areas of your physiology and your response to altitude. And you're going to have way more to say about this, but I think like the timeline someone's setting up for their trip is huge too. So like
Oh, yeah.
I would love to hear you kind of expand on that of like, I bet some people rush that timeline versus some people might be a little bit more conservative. And I think that's a huge component to it, along with like the rate of ascent. So
Right.
having all that stuff kind of dialed in is just as important as making sure your physiology is dialed in.
Yeah,
So,
it's true. And I think, most guide companies, unless you're doing a rapid ascent and that's what you signed up for, most guide companies have spare days in the schedule. They've built a schedule based on giving you time to acclimatize. I don't think you ever fully acclimatize,
yeah.
but there's acclimatization hikes, there's rest days, there's, climbing up and then coming back down and doing those kinds of rotations. And I think people sometimes I understand the emotion around it, right? You want to do everything you can and you want to like train hypoxically and hypercapnically, whatever that word is. Like you want to do all the things, but we forget that the schedule is actually built, like the default schedule is built to give you enough time to acclimatize. And people have
Yeah.
been climbing that way successfully for decades. I like hacks, but I don't like cheating Mother Nature either.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a point where I think you cross that line and you're trying to just like run up there by acclimatizing at home and people get into trouble. And I guess I would go back to what we said a few minutes ago, like you have to still have fitness as a foundation in order to be able to do those things. You can't, that's not something you can skip out on.
Yeah, I think that's great. But I could see just that like heuristic side of it of,
Totally.
summit fever. Like I gotta get up there
I've
and
been there. Yeah.
yeah,
And and also pressure from work, right? I can only get a couple of
right.
weeks off. My kid's graduating from college. There's all these things. There's something important going on at work that we're trying to like shoehorn sometimes climbs into this finite amount of time.
Yeah.
And I always think that the mountains, like they're allowing us to climb. They're giving us these windows that are safe to do so. And we can't rush that. And we have to let the mountain and our bodies be in charge.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Well, thanks, Tom, as usual. It was great chatting with you. I appreciate all your tips and all the science, and I know it'll be super helpful for people.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can definitely redirect them my way. I'm happy to chat.